All right, in this video, I want to talk pretty broadly about some of the most central texts in Judaism, the Torah, and some of the stories that are involved there, particularly the stories of Abraham, Moses, the patriarchs, and some of the matriarchs that we have in Judaism. One thing I think that, or a couple of things I think we need to understand right out of the bat, is that Judaism is probably the oldest surviving monotheistic religion. Now, for sure, there can be debate if Hinduism is a monotheistic or a polytheistic religion. But especially in this part of the world, the Jews are somewhat unique. That initially they believed they were henotheists, and henotheism is this idea that there are many gods, but people believe that their God is the best God. And so when you read part of the Hebrew Bible, there's this acknowledgement that the Hittites have a god, that the Amorites have a god, that the Canaanites have a god, the Jebusites, the Babylonians, that they all have gods, but the Jewish God was the supreme God, was the God of the universe. And this then evolved into a pretty strict monotheism, that the Jews believe that there is only one God, and it's the God that Jews call Yahweh. Another important or an interesting fact about Judaism is that there are religious Jews and then there are secular Jews. And another way to say that is that there are Jews who believe in God and who practice the religion of Judaism. And then there are Jews who are Jewish by lineage, by their ethnic backgrounds. And sometimes these people do or do not believe in God. So it is not uncommon to meet an atheistic Jew or an agnostic Jew, a Jewish person who is Jewish because of their ethnic background, because of their lineage, but they are not Jewish in how they practice. These religious rituals. They might participate in the Jewish New Year, in the Day of Atonement, but they are doing it more from a cultural background rather than a religious background. And then I think the final thing, and it's interesting that we study Judaism. Some people think it's so small. It's only 15 million people. Why study Judaism? Judaism for sure is profoundly important historically. Not only did it give rise to Judaism or to Christianity, or was Christianity born out of Judaism, but Islam was born out of Christianity and Judaism. There are three Abrahamic religions. There are three religions of the book that we talk about in the West. And not only then, also some of the historical importance of Jewish people and Jewish culture have really shaped the modern world. One thing I think that we need to try to understand is that every religion has a kind of foundational text. Now, for sure, Jews would call that the Hebrew Bible, and I'll get there in a second. But the main text that the Jews use and read regularly is the Torah. And the Torah is what you see depicted here as a scroll. And just a side note, these priests or rabbis are wearing what we call talif, which is a box of the scroll that a Jewish man will wear on his forehead. And that goes back to the Jewish prayer that they pray every day that says, mark this as a sign on your forehead. So Torah, is oftentimes mistranslated as law, but really means teaching or instruction. There is a lot more to the Torah than just, giving the 613 laws that the Jewish people have. But the Jewish Sabbath worship, so every Saturday when Jews go to the synagogue to worship, it is really centered around the Torah, and it is centered around reading the Torah, kind of singing, praying, doing a lot of things. If you're familiar with Christian worship, that Christians do on a semi-regular basis. Here, I want to just show you an example of three ways in which the Torah is stored. So all three of these, you can see there are doors right here. All three of these are to symbolize the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant in the Hebrew Bible was this kind of box in which the Jews would carry around, and it would hold, of course, important artifacts in Judaism. And this Ark of the Covenant right here, on all three of these, you can see it's kind of hidden back there. They all hold the Torah, which is, of course, an important element of the Jewish tradition. And this is open every Sabbath, and the Torah is brought out to what I'm depicting here is called a bima. And this is where the Torah is read from. You can see it also here. These gentlemen are reading the Torah from what's called a bima. It's the place where Jews read the Torah. And so if you are familiar with the Torah or with the Hebrew Bible in general, you'll know that the Jews have 24 books that are divided into three major sections. Of course, you have the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then we have what are called the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im are the prophets. Of course, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. But whereas Christians would say that there are books of history, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, Jews understand those books more in like the prophetic sense, as rather than a historical sense. And then you have the Ketuvim, the writings. And so this term you'll see often called the Tanakh, and you can spell it several different ways. It just basically means Torah, Netavim, and then Ketuvim, the three ways in which Jews divide out their Hebrew Bible. So the Hebrew Bible was written between essentially the 10th century BCE and the 1st century BCE, with the Torah reaching its final form around the year like 400-ish before the Common Era. However, the final canonization process, so once the Bible, the Hebrew Bible was officially kind of canonized and then closed, was in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era, in part due to the rise of Christianity, as a way to separate the Jewish tradition from the Reform movement that was born out of Judaism that eventually became Christianity. So I think that there are maybe kind of 5 core themes that exist in the Torah. The first is that God is active in history, that there is a single beginning. You and I in our scientific age would call this the Big Bang. But then, time is progressing towards an end. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, Jews are convinced that God is active in history, that God is working in and through history to bring God's purposes. And God is using people to do that. Another theme that we find in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the Torah, is this idea of a relationship. That God enters into a covenant relationship between God and God's people. And God chose the Jews for a couple of reasons. One, they were oppressed. They were slaves at the hands of the Egyptians. But secondly, the Jews are there to show the world that there is one God and who this God is. Another thing we find in the Hebrew Bible, and again, particularly the Torah, is this theme of liberation and solidarity. That the people of Israel were born out of slavery. They were liberated out of oppression. And so then the Jewish people, as a religion and as a nation, are to be in solidarity with those who are oppressed. Another thing that we see, and I mentioned this kind of, it connects with the first one, that there's this theme in particularly Genesis that argues that God is creative, and that's an active verb. That God's creation is ongoing, it is active, and that God partners with humans to create. And then again, finally, in the book of Exodus, there is this theme of human freedom, that humans misuse their freedom at times, and this idea of oppression and liberation. Early on in the book of Genesis chapter 12, we're introduced to this man named Abraham. And Abraham is considered the patriarch of all of the 3 monotheistic religions. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all go back to Abraham. And Abraham has a really unique story that he had an encounter with God, and God told him to leave his town, leave his country, and to travel to the land of Canaan. And I'll show you where this is here in a little bit. And so Abraham does it. He obeys God, and God promises Abraham to make a great nation out of him, to give his descendants land, to bless them to bless those who bless him, and then to curse those who curse him. And in the Hebrew Bible, Abraham is a probably unique figure insofar as he did what God told him to do. God told him to go, and he packed up and he went. And there's this idea of him being not only the father of Judaism, of all three of the Abrahamic traditions, but also the father of the descendants. And so Abraham is promised that he will be the father of many nations. And yet he's super old, and his wife is super old. And if you are familiar with this story, Abraham first has a son with his wife's servant or slave called Hagar. And then that is the son Ishmael. And then secondly, he had a son with his wife, Sarah, who is named Isaac. And so in a really interesting way, of course, Muslims, they trace their heritage back. Arabs trace their heritage back to Abraham, and so do Jews as well. And so you have this story in the Hebrew Bible where God asks Abraham to go sacrifice his son. And this is, I think, a very famous painting of this event by, I believe this is Caravaggio. And Abraham's willing to do it. Again, he's obedient. These stories are much more than just a story. The Jews are really setting this narrative that they are a people who are obedient to the call of God. And upon being obedient, God stops Abraham from killing his son, and he gives him a ram, a sacrificial ram. Just a quick note, Muslims have the same story in the Quran, and yet it's Ishmael that Abraham was going to sacrifice, not Isaac. And then, Abraham has, sons, and then they marry. And so we have these few stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Of course, they all have wives. And so I think that it is inaccurate to just talk about the patriarchs of the Jewish tradition. We also have to talk about the matriarchs of the Jewish tradition. Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, they are not unimportant people in these narratives. They are profoundly important in the development of the tradition. Now, there's one story that you may be familiar with between like Jacob and Esau. Jacob, his name kind of really means heel grabber. He's one who always tries to get ahead. And so he tricks Esau, and the story is really quite interesting. But eventually, there's this setting in that story where Jacob wrestles with a stranger. Somebody kind of just engages him in a wrestling match, and they wrestle all night long. And eventually, it turns out that the person whom Jacob is wrestling with is God, or an angel of God. And Jacob asks for a blessing. And it takes a while for God or Jacob or the angel to give Jacob a blessing. But when God does bless him, they rename Jacob to Israel. So Israel, you want to understand this, is a term that means to struggle or to wrestle with God. Again, this idea that God is active and working in and through creation. So Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and then 12 sons, and these became kind of the 12 tribes of Israel. Another really important figure in the Jewish tradition is Moses. Moses' name, the word Moses, means to draw out, and so of course this has a double meaning, that Moses was drawn out of the water that his mom and his sister put him in the Nile. But then also Moses is going to be the one who helps God draw out God's people from their oppression. And so what's really interesting about the Moses narrative is that this is the first time that God names God's self. God shows up to Moses and says, "Hey, I want you to go liberate my people." And Moses says, "Well, who are you? Who am I supposed to tell these people who you are?" And God responds in a really kind of unique and interesting way that says, that is dependent upon the word sort of to be, where God says, "I am who I am," or "I will be who I will be." And so there's this idea, again, that God is an active verb. Just a total side note, the book of John in the New Testament picks up on this, where Jesus several times uses the phrase "I am," perhaps as a way to connect connect Jesus back with his Jewish ancestry. And what you see here is a picture of people alongside President Obama. They are doing the Passover meal. One of the important things of the Moses kind of motif or the Moses narrative is that he is essentially a nobody who becomes a very powerful and important person in the Egyptian way of life and in their culture. And yet there's this part of the story where Moses kills an Egyptian, and so he flees. And upon fleeing, he has this encounter with God, and God says, "I want you to go liberate my people." And Moses says, "I can't, for I can't speak well. I'm not very well versed in speaking." Again, total side note: you see that same motif when the Prophet Muhammad is called to speak by God. And so what Moses does is he goes to Pharaoh and he says, "Hey, let my people go, liberate them from their oppression." And what we see in this narrative is this constant battle between Pharaoh and the God of the Jews. And in so many of those interactions, Pharaoh just does stupid things. For example, he tries to wipe out the population that is building his cities by killing all the boys, which, if you think about it for a second, is really quite dumb. If you really want to wipe out the population, don't kill the young men, kill the young women. And so there is this kind of epic back and forth, and eventually, upon the 10th plague, the firstborn sons of all of the Jewish people are spared. If they put lamb's blood above their homes, and then the firstborn son of all of the Egyptians are killed. And this is what is being celebrated over here as the Passover, the liberation of God's people from Egypt. And so the central moment, perhaps, in the history of the Jews not only comes from them being liberated from their oppression, but when God gives them the Ten Commandments, the law, again, the teachings, the core identity of how to be Jewish and what it means to be Jewish. If you're familiar with the Ten Commandments, you'll know that the first 4 deal with the relationship with God, and then the next 6 deal with how to be in relationship with fellow human beings. And the Torah ends, so the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it ends essentially with the death of Moses. The Jewish people are about to enter the promised land, the land that they had been promised to Abraham, but Moses never sees it. He is probably, in many ways, the person responsible for the creation of the Jewish people. And so, of course, he is very much venerated and adorned in the Jewish tradition. And so in total, in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the Torah, we have this narrative of the beginning of the Jewish people, of God liberating them from oppression and God making them God's people. And throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, then, we see that ebb and flow, the ins and outs of that relationship, that covenant relationship that they have with God.